Welcome back, guys. We all know the blinding stadium lights, the deafening screams of millions of armies, and those flawless, gravity-defying moves. It looks incredibly perfect, right? But hold on a second. What really happens when the spotlight suddenly turns into a terrifying trap? Behind their brilliant smiles, there are heartbreaking incidents, unseen tears, and pure agony that made the entire stadium freeze in shock. Are you ready to uncover the painful truth? Who secretly suffered on stage just to keep the show going? Let's dive in. Number 7. Jin. Deafening Blast, The Hidden Agony. Picture this, guys. It's October 2016. The crisp, unforgiving autumn wind is blowing through the bustling coastal city of Busan, and the atmosphere at the highly anticipated One Asia Festival is absolutely electric, crackling with a raw, unbridled intensity that you can almost physically taste in the air. BTS, at this exact pivotal moment in history, is standing on the terrifying yet exhilarating precipice of unprecedented global superstardom, riding the massive, unstoppable, and revolutionary wave of their legendary Blood, Sweat, and Tears era. The immense expectations resting heavily on their young shoulders are heavier than a mountain. They are no longer just a struggling hip-hop group from a small agency. They are a rising cultural phenomenon fighting tooth and nail to prove their absolute worth to a fiercely competitive, unforgiving industry that constantly waits for them to stumble. Millions of judgmental eyes, along with the adoring, starry-eyed gazes of fiercely loyal fans, are glued to the sprawling stage. Armies are screaming their lungs out, enthusiastically waving their glowing light sticks in a breathtaking synchronized ocean of brilliant light, completely oblivious to the sudden, terrifying reality that is about to forcefully unfold right before their very eyes. Enter Kim Sok-jin, affectionately known worldwide as Jin, the eldest brother, the self-proclaimed worldwide handsome, and the quiet, unshakable emotional pillar of the group, who has always meticulously hidden his own deep-seated burdens, profound anxieties, and physical exhaustions behind those iconic dad joke-filled smiles and his signature incredibly charming flying kisses. He stands proudly there under the harsh, blinding stadium lights, radiating an undeniable aura of majestic confidence, looking like an absolute ethereal prince ready to effectively conquer the musical world. But nobody, not even the most eagle-eyed, perceptive fan sitting in the very front row, knows that this specific, seemingly routine stage is about to mercilessly test his physical limits and mental endurance to the absolute breaking point. As the heavy, intoxicating, and deeply sensual bass of the music aggressively drops, echoing powerfully through the massive stadium speakers, the intricate, bone-crushing, and highly demanding choreography immediately begins. The collective energy in the massive, packed venue reaches a feverish, explosive boiling point. Everything seems perfectly rehearsed, impeccably timed, flawlessly calculated, creating a mesmerizing, hypnotic symphony of rapid motion and heart-pounding sound. But then, without a single shred of warning or hesitation, disaster suddenly strikes with the terrifying, unforgiving speed of a sniper's bullet. In the absolute chaotic middle of an intensely fast-paced dance break, right at the soaring, breathless climax of the demanding performance, where every single muscle in his body is already screaming for oxygen, a massive, shockingly unannounced burst of stage pyrotechnics violently explodes directly next to Jin's precise position. We are not just talking about a harmless, tiny, decorative spark here, guys. We are talking about a brutal, concussive, terrifying blast of scorching hot fire and thick, suffocating gray chemical smoke that detonates mere inches from his delicate face, specifically erupting right next to his highly sensitive, custom-molded in-ear monitor. The sudden, deafening, ear-splitting crack of the explosive blast instantly sends a vicious, invisible, aggressive shockwave straight into his fragile eardrum, creating a level of sudden, intense, localized physical trauma that would instantly drop any normal, untrained person straight to the cold, hard floor in pure, unadulterated agony. For a split,
terrifying second, time itself seems to entirely freeze in the massive stadium. If you meticulously analyze the grainy fan cams from that fateful night, slowing down the chaotic footage frame by agonizing frame, you can clearly see the exact heartbreaking micro-expression when the agonizing pain forcefully hits him like a speeding freight train. His expressive eyes forcefully squeeze tightly shut in blinding, inescapable agony. His hand instinctively, almost violently shoots up to desperately clutch his heavily ringing ear, and his typically flawless, composed face deeply contorts in a raw, completely unfiltered expression of pure shock, terrifying disorientation, and burning, stinging pain. The shrill, high-pitched ringing aggressively echoing in his ear canal must have been absolutely paralyzingly deafening, entirely drowning out the heavy thumping bass of the backing track, instantly throwing his crucial internal equilibrium and spatial awareness completely off balance, abruptly leaving him suddenly and terrifyingly isolated in a suffocating, terrifying bubble of complete silence and searing physical pain, while the rest of the completely oblivious world forcefully continues to excitedly scream and passionately dance around him. Can you even begin to mentally process or emotionally comprehend that terrifying level of absolute paralyzing panic? Your crucial sense of hearing is suddenly and violently ripped away. Your ear feels like it is being continuously pierced by a relentlessly red-hot needle. Your vision is momentarily completely blurred by the stinging, acrid chemical smoke of the fireworks, yet you are deeply entrenched in the absolute middle of a high-stakes, immensely critical live broadcast being actively watched by millions of judging eyes across the globe, with your 6 beloved, hard-working younger brothers entirely relying on you to flawlessly maintain the complex, rapidly shifting spatial formation. For a terrifying, heart-stopping millisecond, millions of deeply observant armies carefully watching the gigantic LED screens simultaneously hold their collective breath, a massive, unified gasp of pure horror echoing silently through the expansive global fandom as they immediately realized something has gone horribly, dangerously wrong with their beloved eldest member. Will he finally collapse in tears under the immense crushing pressure? Will the entire elaborate multi-million-dollar show forcefully grind to a humiliating, catastrophic halt? The dedicated medical team and frantic staff are probably scrambling wildly in the pitch-dark backstage area, their hearts pounding violently out of their chests, urgently preparing to physically pull him out of the chaotic, dangerous crossfire. But you have to profoundly remember, guys, this is Kim Sok-jin we are intensely talking about, a remarkably resilient man who historically possesses an unbreakable spine forged from absolute unyielding titanium, and a massive heart overflowing with a fierce, protective, almost parental love for his dedicated team. In a jaw-dropping, awe-inspiring display of sheer, almost superhuman mental willpower that still legitimately gives dedicated veteran armies full-body goosebumps and uncontrollably teary eyes to this very fateful day, Kim Sok-jin completely and utterly refuses to surrender to the overwhelming, agonizing darkness threatening to entirely consume him. In a miraculous split-second decision that fundamentally defines true legendary professionalism, he forcefully bites down incredibly hard on his trembling lower lip, forcefully swallows the agonizing, desperate scream that is violently tearing at his constricted throat, violently pulls his heavily shaking hand away from his deeply injured, ringing ear, and relentlessly forces his battered, traumatized body to instantly snap right back into the brutal, unforgiving rhythm of the rapid, exhausting choreography. It is genuinely, terrifyingly beautiful and heartbreaking to closely witness. Every single subsequent calculated step, every single sharp pop and lock of his aching, exhausted body is executed with a desperate, fiery, almost frightening determination, even though you can clearly and painfully see the cold, frantic sweat rapidly forming on his pale brow and the subtle, uncontrollable, agonizing tremors in his strained, overworked worked muscles, deeply betraying the unbearable, suffocating agony he is actively, fiercely fighting against with every single solitary fiber of his extraordinary being. He is literally, remarkably dancing straight through the agonizing, blinding pain, singing his precious heart out flawlessly into the microphone, while his spinning head is highly likely intensely reeling with nauseating, disorienting vertigo, desperately gripping on to his deeply ingrained professionalism, just to make absolutely, unconditionally sure that the millions of terrified armies in the audience don't get overly worried, just to strictly ensure the complex, beautiful stage remains absolutely perfect and completely undisturbed.
Number 6. Jungkook, Shattered Wings, The Golden Tears. Imagine the sheer, unparalleled magnitude of the legendary O2 Arena in London, standing proudly under the crisp, gloomy, yet electrifying autumn sky of October 2018. The Love Yourself World Tour has finally, triumphantly reached the historic, deeply revered shores of the United Kingdom, completely selling out one of the most prestigious, dauntingly massive entertainment venues on the entire European continent in a matter of mere frantic minutes. The air vibrating through the sprawling neon-lit streets of London is thick, almost suffocating with the passionate, earth-shattering anticipation of tens of thousands of deeply devoted armies who have traveled from every conceivable corner of the globe, waiting outside in the freezing cold for days just to witness the unparalleled, gravity-defying spectacle of the century. Right at the absolute untouchable center of this phenomenal, history-making whirlwind stands Jungkook, globally celebrated and universally feared by competitors as the undisputed golden maknae of BTS. He is the absolute, unyielding powerhouse of the group, a fiercely competitive, insanely talented prodigy whose incredibly robust, muscular physique and breathtakingly relentless, sharp choreography have meticulously crafted an intimidating, flawless aura of absolute physical invincibility. Jungkook is the very embodiment of explosive youth and limitless energy, a man who famously throws his entire physical being into every single bone-crushing dance move as if his very survival utterly depends on it, constantly pushing past the normal biological limits of human endurance just to hear the deafening, euphoric roar of the stadium crowd. But the universe, in all its cruel, unpredictable irony, has a deeply terrifying, utterly heartbreaking way of abruptly reminding us that even the most brilliantly shining stars made of seemingly unbreakable titanium are still agonizingly fragile human beings underneath the blinding, glamorous spotlight. Just mere hours, perhaps even agonizing minutes before the colossal, multi-million-dollar production is scheduled to officially kick off, deep within the chaotic, dimly lit, labyrinthine corridors of the frantic backstage area, the unthinkable, the unimaginable suddenly, violently unfolds. While innocently and diligently stretching his highly tuned athletic body, eagerly preparing to deliver the absolute performance of a lifetime, Jungkook tragically collides with a heavy piece of floor furniture in the cramped, bustling waiting room. It is not just a simple, dismissible bump or a minor, harmless scratch. It is a brutally deep, incredibly severe laceration directly on his vulnerable heel, a critical, heavily bleeding wound on the exact fundamental pivot point his entire complex dancing heavily relies upon. The sudden, agonizingly sharp pain instantly shoots up his leg, completely paralyzing the bustling room as panicked, frantic staff members urgently scream for the on-site emergency medical team. Imagine the absolute suffocating terror tightly gripping his young, ambitious heart as the stern, professional doctors urgently rush in with sterile bandages and cold, hard medical facts.
Their final, uncompromising verdict drops like a devastating heavy iron anvil in the dead silence of the room. The wound is far too deep. The risk of severe, irreversible muscular and tissue damage is dangerously high, and therefore performing any form of intense choreography is strictly, categorically forbidden. For a fiercely dedicated, relentlessly passionate artist like Jungkook, whose entire profound sense of self-worth and identity is so deeply, intrinsically tied to his ability to perfectly perform for his beloved fans, those clinical words are an absolute, shattering death sentence. He doesn't just want to dance, he desperately, fundamentally needs to dance. Yet the brutal, uncompromising reality of his torn, bleeding flesh firmly anchors him to the cold, unforgiving ground. When the massive, blinding stadium lights finally erupt in a dazzling, blinding display of lasers and the deafening, ground-shaking screams of the London crowd violently pierce the air, Jungkook is not soaring through the air or sharply popping his chest to the heavy, intoxicating bass. Instead, in a deeply heartbreaking, visually shocking contrast that immediately sends an agonizing wave of confusion and profound sadness rippling through the massive sea of glowing army bombs, he is seen slowly, carefully rising from the stage lift, completely isolated, silently sitting on a solitary, stationary swiveling stool positioned awkwardly at the far edge of the sprawling stage. His 6 fiercely loyal brothers bravely and dynamically execute the impossibly complex, exhausting formations of their legendary high-octane set list around him, while Jungkook, the usual energetic center, is tragically, agonizingly confined to his tiny wooden prison. The sheer, overwhelming psychological torture of that agonizing situation is incredibly difficult to mentally comprehend. You can literally see the intense, burning frustration, the suffocating, heavy guilt, and the profound, agonizing helplessness aggressively radiating from his dark, expressive eyes every single time the infectious beat drops, and his deeply ingrained muscle memory desperately, instinctively twitches, practically begging his injured, wrapped foot to leap into the air. He sings his absolute heart out, his incredibly stable, honey-like vocals echoing powerfully through the gigantic arena, desperately trying to compensate for his physical immobility with every single ounce of vocal passion he can forcefully muster. But the grueling, emotional concert slowly nears its inevitable end. The heavy, crushing weight of his perceived internal failure becomes entirely too much for his incredibly kind, fiercely perfectionist heart to silently bear. During the normally joyous, wildly energetic encore of Anpan Man, the carefully constructed, brave, emotional dam suddenly and violently bursts. The absolute, undeniable devastation physically overtakes him. Right there, in front of tens of thousands of fans and millions of global viewers, the invincible golden maknae entirely breaks down, his broad, strong shoulders shaking violently as he completely buries his tear-stained, deeply flushed face into a white towel, crying with a raw, agonizing, completely unfiltered intensity that instantly shatters the collective hearts of the entire global fandom. It is a profoundly raw, intensely naked moment of pure vulnerability, an overwhelming outpouring of sorrow not from the physical, stinging pain of his sliced heel, but from the massive, unbearable heartbreak of feeling like he had deeply, unforgivably disappointed the millions of people who had waited their entire lives to see him perfectly shine. The incredibly moving, incredibly beautiful response from the stadium is absolutely legendarily deafening. The massive London crowd instantly, intuitively stops screaming and begins passionately, uniformly chanting John Cook in a massive, overwhelming wave of unconditional love and protective reassurance, while his deeply caring members like the incredibly empathetic Jimin and the fiercely protective Tae-young immediately rush to his side, gently holding his trembling shoulders, wiping away his heavy tears, and softly reminding him that his mere breathing presence is more than enough.
Number 5. RM. Suffocating heat, the leader's breathless battle, a frightening collapse. Transport your absolutely astounded minds completely back to the sweltering, incredibly unforgiving summer of July 2016, right in the bustling, densely populated heart of Beijing, China, where the air is unimaginably thick, intensely sticky, and overwhelmingly heavy with an oppressive, stifling humidity that legitimately makes every single desperate human breath feel like a grueling, utterly exhausting physical chore. The phenomenal, globally rising septet is triumphantly bringing their highly emotional, beautifully nostalgic, the most beautiful moment in life on stage epilogue massive tour to a massive, deafeningly screaming crowd of deeply devoted fans who have eagerly waited countless agonizing months, meticulously saving every single hard-earned penny they had, just for this exact magical, once-in-a-lifetime evening. The sprawling stadium is packed to the absolute brim, forming a beautiful, mesmerizing, violently shifting ocean of glowing lights. But beneath the dazzling, multi-million-dollar production, a terrifying, invisible enemy is silently, aggressively lurking in the stifling, dangerously poorly ventilated atmosphere of the massive venue. Standing proudly at the absolute, untouchable forefront of this monumental, history-making cultural movement is Kim Nam-joon, universally recognized and deeply respected globally as RM, the towering, intensely intellectual, and undeniably brilliant leader of BTS, a remarkably strong man whose incredibly broad shoulders have flawlessly and silently carried the massive, crushing psychological weight of the group's immense struggles, endless industry criticisms, and soaring, impossible ambitions since their very humble, difficult inception. He is the unshakable, deeply stoic pillar, the calm, relentlessly reassuring voice of pure reason, and the fearless, fiercely protective titanium shield for his 6 younger, incredibly talented brothers, a dedicated captain who would willingly, without a single solitary moment of hesitation, walk straight through roaring, scorching hellfire if it explicitly meant keeping his precious team completely safe and thriving. But on this specific, fateful, and terrifyingly hot night, the brutal, uncompromising, and deeply unforgiving laws of human biology are about to mercilessly, violently betray his unyielding, godlike willpower. As the relentlessly high-energy, incredibly physically demanding concert fiercely kicks off with a rapid, exhausting series of intensely fast-paced, bone-crushing choreographies, the already sweltering, suffocating temperature inside the packed, roaring stadium violently skyrockets to dangerously high, deeply alarming levels, rapidly turning the vibrant, expansive stage into a literal, scorching sauna of blinding LED lights, blasting, scorching pyrotechnics, and violently depleting oxygen that instantly threatens to entirely suffocate anyone daring enough to passionately dance upon it. RM passionately, aggressively throwing every single solitary ounce of his remaining physical energy into the aggressive, heavy hip-hop beats, completely and stubbornly ignores the glaring, terrifying internal warning signs that his severely overtaxed, overheating body is desperately, frantically trying to send to his focused brain.
The dizzying, highly nauseating heat is aggressively radiating directly from the wooden floorboards. The thick, heavy, stale air is violently refusing to properly fill his expanding, burning lungs, and a cold, clammy, terrifying sweat begins to rapidly and uncontrollably drench his unusually pale, exhausted face. If you closely, meticulously analyze the heartbreakingly tense, incredibly stressful footage from that specific grueling segment of the legendary show, you can visibly, painfully see the exact terrifying micro-moments where the towering leader's normally commanding, incredibly powerful stage presence begins to subtly, dangerously falter. His deeply labored breathing becomes incredibly shallow, frantic, and terrifyingly panicked. His intensely focused, sharp eyes begin to terrifyingly glaze over with a disorienting, blinding, dizzying haze, and his strong, highly muscular legs visibly tremble and desperately shake under the immense, crushing, relentless exertion of the intricate footwork. He is literally, agonizingly fighting a completely losing, desperate physical war against his own rapidly failing, overheating physiology, yet in a profoundly heartbreaking, awe-inspiring display of absolute legendary professionalism that still deeply shatters fans to their core, he forcefully and painfully stretches his trembling, dry lips into a reassuring, charismatic, dimpled smile, desperately pushing his burning, aching, screaming muscles to flawlessly execute the very next sharp, demanding dance move just to strictly protect the beautiful, fragile illusion of absolute perfection for the thousands of screaming, crying fans who happily remain entirely, blissfully unaware of his silent, agonizing, suffocating torture. However, the absolute, terrifying millisecond the blinding stage lights temporarily and mercifully plunge into a pitch-black darkness for a quick, chaotic, highly synchronized wardrobe change, the carefully constructed, incredibly brave emotional and physical facade violently, spectacularly, and completely crumbles. The absolute second RM heavily, exhaustedly steps off the visible stage and officially crosses the hidden dark threshold into the frantic, dimly lit, cramped backstage area, his towering, highly powerful frame completely and utterly gives out on him, violently collapsing into the terrified, frantically waiting arms of the panicked, rushing staff members like a massive, heavy oak tree suddenly, devastatingly crashing to the cold, unforgiving concrete. The sudden, absolutely chaotic, mind-numbing scene that immediately unfolds behind the glamorous, heavy velvet curtains is the absolute literal definition of a heart-stopping, agonizing nightmare. Frantic, desperate screams fiercely and violently echo through the narrow, crowded corridors. Emergency medical personnel wildly sprint through the dense, panicked crowd of makeup artists and stylists, and the terrifying, heavy realization that their completely invincible leader has suddenly violently strikes the remaining, heavily sweating BTS members with a sickening, paralyzing, ice-cold dread that instantly freezes the blood in their veins. RM is completely, terrifyingly hyperventilating on the hard floor, his broad, strong chest violently heaving up and down as he frantically, desperately, and loudly gasps for the precious, life-saving air that his exhausted, heat-stroked, burning lungs are aggressively demanding but simply cannot find in the stifling, intensely humid backstage environment. Without a single agonizing second of hesitation, the frantic, highly trained medical team urgently, forcefully straps a clear plastic emergency oxygen mask tightly over his remarkably pale, sweat-drenched, completely exhausted face, desperately pumping pure, concentrated, life-saving oxygen directly into his failing respiratory system, while frantically checking his dangerously elevated racing pulse and his dangerously fluctuating blood pressure. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming, utterly suffocating psychological horror of that profoundly intense, deeply terrifying moment for his 6 younger brothers, who are desperately, anxiously hovering nearby, their own exhausted hearts pounding violently in pure, unadulterated terror, as they helplessly, tearfully watch the strongest, most resilient, and most reliable man they have ever known completely incapacitated, violently struggling to simply draw a basic, fundamental human breath. The stern, uncompromising medical professionals immediately make the devastating, heartbreaking, yet entirely necessary and absolutely critical decision. Namjoon's physical condition is far too dangerous. His severe heat stroke and extreme physical exhaustion are incredibly critical, and even attempting to send him back out onto that scorching, suffocating stage would be an absolute, undeniable, and catastrophic death sentence.
Number 4. Jimin, the sudden abyss, the swan's terrifying freefall. Cast your vividly imaginative minds all the way back to the incredibly vibrant, deeply nostalgic, and intensely humid late summer of August 2015, right in the bustling, culturally rich, and neon-drenched heart of Osaka, Japan, a dynamic, buzzing city where thousands of fiercely loyal, incredibly passionate Japanese armies had gathered in massive, overflowing, and overwhelmingly excited droves for the highly anticipated, wonderfully intimate Japan Official Fan Meeting Volume 2, Undercover Mission. Unlike the colossal, deafening, tightly choreographed global stadium tours that would completely dominate their future, these earlier fan meetings were beautifully designed to be highly interactive, deeply personal, and incredibly lighthearted, featuring absolutely hilarious stage games, casual, chaotic banter, and a uniquely warm, comforting atmosphere where the beloved members could finally comfortably let their heavy guards down and just be their delightfully dorky, authentic selves with the fans they loved so dearly. Right at the vibrant, glowing epicenter of this joyful, echoing laughter stands Park Jimin, the breathtakingly elegant lead vocalist and main dancer, a man universally revered as the absolute, undisputed Black Swan of BTS, whose mesmerizing, gravity-defying contemporary dance background and terrifyingly relentless, obsessive pursuit of absolute stage perfection have made him a global, captivating icon of unparalleled physical grace and mesmerizing artistic beauty. Jimin is deeply, notoriously known throughout the entire ruthless entertainment industry for his incredibly kind, fiercely empathetic heart and his intensely dangerous self-sacrificing habit of constantly, recklessly pushing his own fragile physical limits entirely beyond the natural, safe edge of human capability, constantly demanding nothing short of absolute flawless perfection from his own aching body, just to strictly ensure every single person in the massive audience leaves with a beautiful, unforgettable memory burned into their minds. But on this specific, seemingly joyful, profoundly innocent afternoon, the very same fierce, burning competitive spirit and desperate, deep-seated desire to thoroughly entertain his beloved fans would terrifyingly, unexpectedly turn against him, violently plunging the entire joyful arena into a sudden, heart-stopping, agonizing nightmare of sheer, unadulterated terror. During a completely harmless, seemingly basic, and incredibly fun interactive game segment strictly requiring the highly energetic members to hold their breath for an extended, challenging period of time, the atmosphere was beautifully light, wonderfully comedic, and filled with the deafening, supportive cheers of thousands of absolutely delighted fans enthusiastically egging their beloved idols on. Jimin, being the fiercely competitive, fiercely dedicated performer he fundamentally is, completely and stubbornly refused to give up, deliberately,
forcefully holding the precious life-sustaining air inside his expanding lungs for a dangerously, terrifyingly long amount of time, absolutely determined to win the silly, harmless game strictly for the pure, unadulterated amusement of the roaring, laughing audience. However, the brutal, completely unforgiving laws of human physiology do not care about your fierce dedication or your deeply passionate heart. By forcefully, recklessly depriving his own highly active, rapidly beating heart and his focused, complex brain of crucial, vital oxygen for that extended, unnatural duration, his parasympathetic nervous system suddenly, violently, and aggressively triggered a massive, terrifying plunge in his blood pressure, an involuntary, completely uncontrollable biological failsafe that instantly, ruthlessly shut down his conscious mind without a single solitary millisecond of warning. If you dare to deeply imagine the absolute suffocating horror of that exact fleeting microsecond, it is enough to make your own blood run completely, terrifyingly cold. One absolute second, Jimin is standing proudly, smiling beautifully, actively participating in the joyful, loud banter, and in the absolute, deeply terrifying fraction of a heartbeat, his incredibly graceful, fiercely disciplined body goes completely, shockingly limp like a violently discarded rag doll. His perfectly focused crescent moon eyes suddenly roll back into a disorienting, terrifying darkness. His incredibly strong, muscular legs utterly and completely buckle beneath him, and the solid, completely trusted stage floor he had conquered 1,000,000 times before suddenly, mercilessly gives way. He violently, aggressively loses all sense of physical balance and spatial awareness, plummeting horrifyingly backwards directly off the highly elevated, dangerously high stage, falling completely backwards into the terrifying, pitch-black, hidden abyss of the equipment gap, completely out of sight. The incredibly sickening, brutally heavy thud of his fragile, unconscious body violently hitting the hard, unforgiving ground below aggressively pierced through the joyful, echoing laughter of the packed arena, instantly, violently shattering the warm, comforting atmosphere, and instantly plunging the massive, crowded venue into a terrifying, paralyzed, absolutely deafening silence of pure, unadulterated shock. The massive, unified gasp of absolute raw horror that immediately erupted from thousands of terrified, weeping armies violently echoed through the large venue like a massive, tragic wave of suffocating despair, while the remaining BTS members, initially completely confused and playfully laughing just a mere second ago, violently froze in absolute bone-chilling terror as their desperate, panic-stricken eyes frantically darted towards the empty, terrifying void where their beloved precious brother had just been standing. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming, paralyzing psychological trauma forcefully gripping the frantic, sprinting backstage crew, the heavy, desperate security guards violently shoving people aside, and the deeply terrified medical staff desperately scrambling wildly into the dark, dangerous pit, their racing hearts pounding aggressively in their throats, completely unsure if they were about to tragically find their brilliant, beautiful star severely, irreparably paralyzed, or facing a catastrophic career-ending spinal injury. The sheer terrifying contrast between the incredibly graceful, seemingly invincible Park Jimin soaring through the air during Spring Day and the incredibly fragile, terrifyingly motionless human being lying completely unconscious in the dark, dusty void below the bright stage is a profoundly haunting, deeply disturbing image that aggressively forces us to painfully confront the deeply terrifying, dangerous physical risks these brilliant artists casually take every single time they step directly into the blinding spotlight. The agonizing, suffocating minutes that slowly, painfully ticked by before the frantic, deeply concerned Big Hit Entertainment staff officially released a frantic, urgent statement confirming that Jimin had been rapidly rushed to the nearest local hospital for comprehensive emergency medical evaluations felt like an absolute, endless, torturous eternity for the millions of deeply terrified, desperately crying fans aggressively refreshing their glowing screens around the entire frantic globe. Miraculously, wonderfully, and thankfully, the incredibly resilient, fiercely strong dancer somehow managed to completely avoid any major catastrophic bone fractures or severe life-altering internal injuries, strictly escaping the terrifying, potentially fatal plunge with only minor, painful bruises and a deeply shaken, heavily traumatized emotional state. Yet, in a profoundly heartbreaking, fiercely tragic display of his incredibly selfless, almost painfully empathetic nature, the absolute, undeniable very first thing Jimin did the exact second he finally regained his full conscious awareness and was discharged from the sterile, cold hospital room was not to heavily rest, cry, or complain about his own terrifying, stinging physical trauma, but to immediately, frantically take to the official group's social media, deeply, tearfully apologizing to his beloved, terrified armies for accidentally, unintentionally causing them so much deep, agonizing worry.
Number 3. Suga, Silent Agony, The Shattered Shoulder, A Decade of Hidden Pain. Prepare yourselves to completely, profoundly shift your entire emotional perspective from the sudden, highly visible, and instantly shocking stage accidents to a deeply sinister, terrifyingly invisible, and excruciatingly prolonged tragedy that was silently, aggressively, and violently tearing a beloved, fiercely dedicated member apart from the very inside out for nearly an entire agonizing, heartbreaking decade. When we actively think of severe concert injuries, we normally envision sudden falls, explosive malfunctions, or immediate breathtaking collapses. But the absolute chilling reality of Min Yoongi, universally revered and intensely respected across the globe as the razor-sharp, fiercely independent, and brilliantly genius producer Suga, completely redefines the very fundamental concept of human endurance and silent, unbearable suffering. To truly comprehensively understand the absolute magnitude of his terrifying on-stage ordeal, we must tragically transport our minds back to the incredibly harsh, deeply uncertain, and heavily struggling pre-debut days of 2012, long before the massive stadiums, the blinding global fame, and the multi-million-dollar productions even existed as a distant, fleeting dream. Back then, a desperate, fiercely ambitious teenage Yoongi was secretly, exhaustedly working a dangerous, low-paying part-time job as a motorcycle delivery boy on the busy, unforgiving, and rain-slicked streets of Seoul, just to barely afford his basic, meager meals and his precious, life-saving music equipment. In a sudden, violent, and highly traumatic crash at a busy intersection, his fragile body was brutally thrown directly onto the harsh, unforgiving asphalt, resulting in a severe, agonizingly painful dislocated shoulder that instantly shattered his physical mobility. Terrified, deeply panicked, and utterly convinced that the strict, demanding entertainment agency would immediately, ruthlessly cut him from the highly competitive debut lineup if they discovered he was fundamentally broken, this incredibly proud, stubbornly resilient young boy made the unimaginably heavy, deeply tragic decision to entirely hide his severe injury, silently suffering in the dark, completely swallowing his agonizing screams, while actively treating his damaged joint with nothing but cheap heat patches and sheer, unadulterated, desperate willpower.
Fast forward through several intense, grueling years to the colossal, ground-shaking, and history-making global stadium tours of the record-breaking Love Yourself and Map of the Soul eras, where the choreography had exponentially, terrifyingly evolved into incredibly complex, bone-crushing, and highly demanding athletic masterpieces that required absolute, flawless physical perfection. For a completely healthy, perfectly conditioned athlete, executing the fiercely aggressive, sharply explosive, and highly intricate arm movements of legendary tracks like Fake Love, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and On is an absolute, literal, and inescapable physical hell. The sheer, overwhelming, and deeply disturbing medical reality of his heavily damaged shoulder meant that every single time he aggressively popped his chest, powerfully lifted his microphone, or sharply extended his arm to hit a precise, critical choreographic beat, he was violently, painfully grinding his own damaged cartilage against unprotected bone, constantly experiencing the terrifying, sickening sensation of his own shoulder joint literally, agonizingly slipping directly out of its fragile socket mid-performance. If you meticulously, painfully, and closely analyze the heartbreaking, heavily scrutinized concert footage from those intense, highly demanding years, desperately zooming in past the blinding, multicolored laser lights and the deafening, euphoric screams of the massive crowd, you can clearly, agonizingly witness the exact, fleeting micro-expressions of raw, unfiltered, searing agony violently flashing across his typically stoic, beautifully calm face. You can visibly see the terrifying, heartbreaking moments where his left arm awkwardly, helplessly hangs completely limp at his side, physically unable to complete the demanding sweeping motion, while his incredibly strong, fiercely determined right arm desperately, frantically attempts to overcompensate just to maintain the beautiful, fragile illusion of absolute, unbroken synchronicity for the millions of adoring fans watching his every single move. Imagine the sheer, suffocating, completely unbearable psychological torment tightly gripping his fiercely proud, incredibly perfectionist heart every single terrifying night he actively stepped onto that colossal stage. He was trapped in a relentless, agonizing war against his own failing biology, deeply terrified that one single wrong movement would finally catastrophically snap the last remaining fragile tendon and permanently, irreversibly destroy the beautiful, unified formation of his precious group. The deeply frantic, heavily chaotic backstage reality during these massive, multi-million-dollar shows was an intensely dark, intensely depressing, and fiercely heartbreaking nightmare that was rigorously, completely shielded from the joyful, screaming public. The absolute agonizing second the heavy velvet concert curtains mercifully closed and the blinding stadium lights faded into darkness, Yoongi would be urgently, frantically rushed by a highly stressed, heavily sweating medical team, his face incredibly pale, heavily drenched in a cold, painful sweat, desperately gritting his teeth in pure, unadulterated agony as they aggressively wrapped his rapidly swelling, inflamed shoulder tightly in thick black kinesiology tape and heavy, suffocating ice packs. There were countless, terrifyingly desperate moments where the searing, burning pain radiating through his entire upper body became so unimaginably intensely unbearable that he required direct, heavy pain-killing injections administered straight into his damaged joint mere minutes before the elevating stage lift violently launched him right back up into the deafening, glaring spotlight, heavily forcing him to immediately plaster a fierce, charismatic, and completely fake smirk on his exhausted face, as if he wasn't secretly, actively enduring the horrifying, agonizing pain of a literal, open physical wound tearing further apart with every single heartbeat. It is a profoundly, deeply sickening, incredibly inspiring, and entirely philosophical reality that violently shatters the very core of our souls. What immense, unimaginable, and completely terrifying level of absolute devotion drives a human being to willingly, silently, and relentlessly subject themselves to nearly a decade of literal physical torture, violently sacrificing their own long-term health and basic comfort just to actively protect a beautiful shared dream and honor a silent, sacred promise made to millions of strangers? When the absolute, undeniable breaking point finally, inevitably arrived in late 2020, forcing him to suddenly, abruptly vanish from the global stage to undergo an incredibly invasive, highly complex, and deeply terrifying surgical reconstruction of his entirely destroyed shoulder, the crushing, overwhelming wave of profound realization, heavy, suffocating guilt, and massive, tearful sorrow that instantly washed over the entire global army was absolutely unprecedentedly astronomical. Fans aggressively wept behind their glowing screens, deeply passionately realizing that the lazy or stiff dance movements some cruel, highly ignorant critics had previously unfairly mocked were actually the beautiful, heartbreaking, and fiercely heroic scars of a remarkably strong man desperately fighting an invisible, excruciatingly painful war just to actively stay on the stage alongside his 6 beloved brothers. Yoongi's profoundly silent, agonizingly long, and deeply terrifying battle against his own shattering body officially stands as the ultimate, heartbreakingly raw, and intensely sobering testament to the incredibly dark, dangerous, and completely unforgiving price of unimaginable global superstardom, proving once and for all that true, undeniable strength is not always loudly, aggressively roared from the mountaintops, but often silently, painfully endured in the dark shadows of a brilliant, blinding spotlight.
Number 2. J-Hope. The blinding blast, the sunshine's terrifying eclipse, a near-fatal strike. Prepare to have your securely fastened, comfortable reality violently and irrevocably shattered because the profoundly terrifying, deeply sickening incident occupying the heavily contested number 2 spot on our agonizingly dramatic countdown actively, aggressively forces us to painfully confront the absolute horrifying fragility of the human body when unexpectedly pitted against the massive, heavy, and highly unpredictable industrial machinery of a multi-million-dollar global stadium production. Picture the incredibly sprawling, massively intimidating architecture of a completely sold-out, globally renowned stadium, fiercely vibrating under the crisp, electrifying night sky as tens of thousands of deeply devoted, screaming armies aggressively wave their blindingly bright light sticks, creating a violently beautiful, undulating ocean of pure, unadulterated passion. Right at the fiercely beating, unstoppable heart of this colossal, deafening musical storm stands Jungkook, universally adored, deeply respected, and internationally celebrated as J-Hope, the absolute, undisputed dance captain, the relentlessly energetic hype man, and the brilliantly radiant human sunshine of BTS, whose infectious, heart-shaped smile and flawlessly executed, bone-crushing street dance movements constantly, effortlessly light up even the darkest, most terrifying corners of the massive stage. He is an incredibly meticulous, fiercely disciplined perfectionist, a man who knows every single solitary inch of the sprawling, highly complex stage layout with the frighteningly precise, calculated accuracy of a veteran military general, leading his 6 deeply exhausted but passionately determined brothers through the highly dangerous, fiercely aggressive choreographic minefield with absolute, unshakable confidence.
But on this specific, intensely heart-stopping and profoundly terrifying night, the incredibly dangerous, fiercely unpredictable, and utterly chaotic nature of live entertainment was about to violently, mercilessly betray his absolute, unwavering trust in the very stage he so proudly called his beautiful, undisputed home. During a massively energetic, highly chaotic, and emotionally euphoric segment of the concert where the members naturally, joyfully scatter across the sprawling, extended stage runways to deeply, personally interact with the frantically screaming, sobbing fans in the heavily crowded front rows, a seemingly innocent, standard piece of everyday stage equipment silently, aggressively transformed into a terrifying, literal weapon of mass destruction. Positioned dangerously close to the very edge of the elevated stage was a massive, highly pressurized, industrial-grade confetti and smoke cannon, a heavy, intimidating piece of complex pneumatic machinery designed to spectacularly, beautifully shoot a massive, blinding cloud of colorful paper and thick chemical smoke hundreds of feet directly into the dark, echoing stadium sky at the exact triumphant climax of the heavy, intoxicating song. J-Hope, completely consumed by the fiery, blinding passion of his own incredible performance, flashing his brilliantly beautiful signature smile directly at a group of frantically waving fans, instinctively, confidently stepped towards the very edge of the stage, placing his incredibly fragile, immensely precious physical body directly, terrifyingly inside the invisible, highly dangerous firing trajectory of the massive, pressurized metal barrel. In a profoundly terrifying, deeply sickening split second that absolutely no human eye could possibly anticipate and no frantic, screaming stage director could possibly prevent, the heavy, complex internal mechanism of the massive cannon suffered a catastrophic, violent, and entirely unexpected premature malfunction. Instead of firing safely, harmlessly upwards into the empty, echoing sky, the heavy, pressurized machine violently, aggressively, and deafeningly detonated with the terrifying explosive force of a literal heavy-caliber gunshot, precisely at the exact horrifying millisecond J-Hope leaned forward, shooting a massive, blinding, incredibly high-velocity blast of thick, scorching chemical smoke, violently heavy debris, and razor-sharp, tightly packed confetti directly, aggressively, and violently straight into his completely unprotected, beautiful, expressive face. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of that sudden, incredibly violent kinetic impact is profoundly, intensely mind-boggling. We are actively talking about an immense, concentrated blast of heavily pressurized air and chemical particulate matter, violently, aggressively assaulting the absolute most delicate, most fragile, and most irreplaceable organs in the entire human body, his precious, incredibly expressive eyes. For a terrifying, heart-stopping, incredibly agonizing millisecond, the absolute paralyzing horror of the sudden violent strike completely ruthlessly erased his brilliant, infectious smile, instantly violently replacing his joyful, energetic aura with a raw, completely unfiltered, agonizing expression of pure, blinding physical shock and terrifying, disorienting agony. If you painstakingly, meticulously slow down the deeply disturbing, incredibly frantic fan cam footage of this exact terrifying micro moment, you can clearly, painfully witness his incredibly strong, muscular body violently, aggressively recoil backward from the sheer, shocking force of the sudden, unexpected blast, his hands instantly, frantically flying upwards to violently, desperately clutch his severely assaulted, heavily burning eyes as a terrifying, blinding wave of absolute, unadulterated darkness and searing, stinging chemical pain violently washes over his entirely shocked, disoriented brain.
Imagine the sheer, overwhelming, paralyzing psychological terror violently, aggressively gripping his fiercely active, brilliantly creative mind in that exact, suffocating, pitch-black second. The terrifying, absolute, soul-crushing fear that his highly precious, incredibly vital eyesight, the very fundamental biological tool he absolutely needs to fiercely navigate the complex, dangerous stage, precisely execute his legendary razor-sharp choreography, and lovingly see the beautiful, glowing faces of his deeply adored fans, might have just been violently, permanently, and irrevocably ripped away from him by a stupid, random, terrifying mechanical failure. The shrill, deafening ringing in his ears, the heavily suffocating, acrid smell of the burnt pyrotechnic chemicals violently invading his lungs, and the agonizing, completely blinding sting aggressively burning his fragile corneas, created a sudden, terrifying, inescapable bubble of pure physical hell, right in the absolute middle of a roaring, ecstatic crowd of tens of thousands of entirely oblivious, screaming people. Yet, in a profoundly inspiring, deeply heartbreaking, and entirely terrifying display of his absolute, legendary, and almost frighteningly human professionalism, J-Hope completely, stubbornly refused to surrender to the overwhelming, agonizing panic that was actively, violently tearing his terrified mind apart. Instead of immediately, justifiably collapsing to the hard, cold floor in agonizing, blinding tears, he violently, forcefully bit down on his trembling, dry lip, desperately squeezed his violently watering, heavily burning eyes tightly shut, and miraculously, unbelievably managed to forcefully, blindly stumble safely away from the dangerous, unpredictable machine, somehow impossibly turning his back directly to the massive zooming stadium cameras, just to meticulously, strictly hide his heavily pained, tearing face from the terrified, observant millions. The absolute chaotic, heart-stopping panic that immediately, violently erupted in the dark, heavily crowded backstage area was completely, utterly astronomical. Highly trained, heavily sweating medical personnel desperately, frantically sprinted to the absolute edge of the dark, hidden stairs, their own racing hearts aggressively pounding out of their chests as they hurriedly, urgently prepared massive, sterile bottles of emergency saline solution, desperately praying to the heavens that the violent, abrasive blast had not catastrophically, permanently scratched his beautiful, delicate corneas or caused severe, irreversible thermal burns to his incredibly sensitive facial tissue. Number 1. V. The Sudden Betrayal. A Calf Torn. The Seated King's Tears. Cast your emotionally exhausted, heavily battered minds back to the highly unprecedented, incredibly strange, and deeply isolating era of late October 2021, a period where the entire globe was still aggressively fighting the lingering, suffocating remnants of a devastating pandemic, and the millions of deeply loyal, globally scattered armies were absolutely, desperately starved for any form of direct, live connection with their beloved, record-breaking septet. The immense astronomical anticipation for the monumental BTS Permission to Dance on-stage global online concert was reaching an absolute feverish and unprecedented boiling point, serving as a massive glowing beacon of beautiful hope and emotional salvation for millions of deeply lonely souls trapped behind glowing screens in their quiet, isolated bedrooms. Right at the fiercely beating, incredibly soulful center of this massive, highly anticipated digital reunion stands Kim Tae-young, universally adored and globally worshipped as V, the remarkably handsome, deeply expressive, and intensely soulful baritone vocalist whose completely captivating, dangerously magnetic stage presence and flawlessly sharp, wildly dynamic dance moves effortlessly command the absolute attention of the entire spinning globe. Tae-young is fundamentally, at his very core, an incredibly passionate,
fiercely emotional and deeply expressive artist who literally breathes and feeds off the dynamic physical energy of his beloved members and his screaming fans, a perfectionist who had spent countless agonizing sweat-drenched months in the suffocating dance studio, violently pushing his fragile physical limits to flawlessly master the highly intricate, incredibly demanding, and aggressively upbeat choreography of their monumental new set list. But in a profoundly cruel, deeply sickening, and utterly unexplainable twist of dark fate that literally feels like a vicious direct punch straight to the gut, the immensely fragile, unpredictable nature of the human anatomy was about to violently, aggressively betray his absolute, unwavering dedication right on the very terrifying eve of this massive, history-making performance. Just mere hours before the blinding stadium lights were scheduled to spectacularly ignite the empty, massive arena in Seoul, during an incredibly intense, highly demanding, and grueling final rehearsal under the suffocatingly hot stage lights, Taehyung suddenly, terrifyingly felt an agonizing, shockingly sharp, and completely paralyzing surge of pure, blinding pain, violently ripped directly through his right calf muscles. It wasn't just a simple, dismissible cramp or a minor everyday ache, it was a deeply severe, incredibly alarming muscular injury that instantly, violently buckled his strong legs, sending a massive, terrifying shockwave of pure, unadulterated panic completely rippling through the entire heavily stressed production crew and his 6 deeply terrified, wildly frantic brothers. The stern, highly specialized emergency medical team was instantly, urgently rushed into the chaotic, heavily tense backstage area, their professional clinical faces grim and entirely unforgiving as they aggressively, meticulously examined the severely damaged, heavily inflamed muscle tissue. Their absolute, final, and completely non-negotiable medical verdict dropped like a massive, suffocating, multi-ton iron anvil right in the dead, agonizing silence of the room. Severe, acute calf muscle pain, requiring immediate, absolute restriction of any vigorous, dynamic movement. The strict, heartbreaking medical order was devastatingly clear. Taehyung was explicitly, entirely forbidden from participating in any of the highly demanding, bone-crushing choreography. For a fiercely proud, intensely passionate performer like V, whose entire beautiful artistic soul is so deeply, intrinsically woven into the very fabric of his dynamic physical expression, hearing those cold, clinical words was an absolute, literal, and completely shattering death sentence to his deeply perfectionist heart. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming, and utterly suffocating psychological devastation violently crashing down upon his fragile, entirely broken spirit. He had meticulously, obsessively prepared his body and soul for this exact magical moment for months, eagerly anticipating the triumphant, explosive feeling of flawlessly executing the legendary moves alongside his fiercely loyal brothers, only to have it violently, mercilessly ripped away by his own failing, betrayed muscles at the very last agonizing second. When the massive multi-million-dollar global broadcast finally spectacularly kicked off and the brilliant, blinding LED screens illuminated the empty stadium to millions of desperately watching fans worldwide, the deeply visually jarring, entirely heartbreaking reality of the situation immediately sent a massive, violent shockwave of pure collective agony rippling through the entire global fandom. While the other 6 fiercely energetic members dynamically, passionately bounded across the sprawling stage, flawlessly executing the highly aggressive, flawlessly synchronized choreography of their legendary explosive hits, Taehyung was tragically, agonizingly confined to an ornate, stationary leather chair positioned heavily at the far edge of the stage, looking like a deeply heartbroken, beautifully tragic king violently exiled from his own glorious, vibrating kingdom. The sheer, overwhelming, and utterly paralyzing emotional torture of that agonizing situation is almost completely, entirely impossible to mentally comprehend unless you deeply, truly understand his fiercely competitive, immensely caring nature. You could visibly, painfully see the intense, burning frustration, the suffocating, heavy, and completely crushing guilt, and the profound, agonizing helplessness aggressively radiating from his beautifully expressive, deeply sorrowful eyes every single time the heavy, intoxicating beat dropped and his deeply ingrained muscle memory desperately, instinctively twitched, his broad shoulders fiercely jumping to the rhythm as his brilliant mind desperately screamed at his injured, heavily bandaged leg to leap into the air and join the beautiful, unified formation. He sat there, utterly trapped in his invisible, heavily agonizing physical cage, singing his absolute precious heart out with a raw, completely unfiltered, and intensely powerful emotional vocal delivery that violently shook the very foundations of the empty stadium, desperately, frantically trying to fiercely compensate for his physical immobility with every single solitary ounce of soulful passion he could forcefully muster from his deeply battered spirit. But as the deeply emotional, highly intense concert slowly, painfully neared its inevitable, beautiful conclusion, the unbelievably heavy, entirely crushing psychological weight of his perceived internal failure simply became far too much for his incredibly kind, fiercely empathetic, and deeply fragile heart to silently, bravely bear. During the normally joyous, emotionally uplifting final speeches, when Taehyung finally solemnly raised his microphone to directly address the millions of completely devastated, heavily weeping fans watching helplessly through their glowing screens, the carefully constructed, incredibly brave emotional dam suddenly, violently, and spectacularly completely shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. His famously deep, incredibly soothing voice violently trembled and heavily cracked with pure, raw, unfiltered devastation as he deeply, profoundly apologized to his beloved armies, his beautiful, expressive face visibly contorting in absolute, agonizing sorrow as he painfully, regretfully confessed that he felt completely, utterly useless sitting helplessly on the side, while his deeply exhausted, heavily sweating brothers worked their absolute hardest. The absolute, undeniable devastation physically and entirely overtook him. The incredibly strong, globally revered idol entirely broke down, his beautiful, soulful eyes welling up with heavy, blinding tears that he desperately, frantically tried to wipe away, crying with a raw, agonizing, completely unfiltered intensity that instantly, violently shattered the collective beating hearts of the entire, highly protective global fandom.